Good evening, everyone. This is the INFOWARS Nightly News. I'm Darren McBreen. It is Friday, July 6, 2012. Here's a look what's coming up.
Tonight, warning shots will not be fired. Army manual outlines plan to kill rioters and confiscate constitutionally protected firearms. We also cover TSA's new policy, ordering travelers to freeze on command. And Aaron Dyke sits down with John Loftus, author of America's Nazi Secret, to discuss the ties between the U.S. government and the Nazi regime of World War II and what it means to us today. All this, plus a special video from Alex Jones on tonight's INFOWARS Nightly News.
So as you can see, we have another jam-packed and informative show lined up for you this evening, but we begin tonight with a newly leaked U.S. Army military police training manual for what they are calling civil disturbance operations. The Army manual outlines the plan to kill rioters and demonstrators in America. That's right, they have plans to confiscate our firearms and kill American citizens on U.S. soil. This during a mass civil unrest, which of course will be engineered by the foreign banks who now run our military. Warning shots will not be fired. Use of deadly force authorized. And this, of course, is the top story right now on Infowars.com. The PDF document, which is dated in 2006, well, it was used for a self-learning course at the U.S. Army Military Police School at Fort McClellan, and it makes it clear that operations apply to both inside and outside the continental United States. The document outlines how military assets will be used to restore and maintain law and order by shooting protesters, I guess, shooting innocent civilians perhaps. And it goes on to describe how prisoners will be processed through internment camps. Wow. So there you have it. Our own military being trained for armed conflict with U.S. citizens. They're being trained to confiscate our guns and preparations to process us into camps during civil unrest. And we are now joined by Dan Feit, who is an investigative journalist for HongPong.com. He's also a graphic artist and web designer. And you initially broke the story, and I was wanting you on today. I was wondering if you could briefly go over the document and tell us how you got your hands on it to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, all the credit is really due here to a really excellent website called publicintelligence.net. They do a really good job systematically finding obscure and limited access files from within the U.S. military and other institutions. I just saw it pop up yesterday and quickly wrote a summary of it for my own site to get that distributed and out there. Essentially, this document ties to a number of other documents which I've been involved in researching. In my personal experience, I covered the 2008 Republican National Convention and the 2009 G20 conference in Pittsburgh through the G-Infinity Media Center, that was independent media that was put together. And so what we have here is a system of expanding, emergency use of domestic military personnel. And at one level that I found the research on earlier, there's something called Con Plan 3502, a Civil Disturbance Operations Concept of Operations Plan run by the U.S. Northern Command. And that was what we found earlier, and Public Intelligence has also helped pull together some other documents from that. And so what we found here was essentially the military police training document to instruct the military police in a number of different important aspects of this general domestic operations planning, including domestic searches without warrants. There's no reference to warrants or those type of constitutional rights in this. This also includes various aspects of crowd control, area control, riot control, and some really kind of terrifying statements about how military-operated detention facilities inside the United States would be protected by lethal force, including the statement that warning shots will not be fired in the event that someone is trying to escape. As soon as they deem a risk of lethal injury, they're just going to shoot you. And it's helpful to have these things on paper and concrete to establish the different levels of this planning structure. And I think that what we're going to see at the Republican and Democratic national conventions later this year, which are national special security events, we're going to see very similar planning frameworks activated that are very reminiscent of this. And this document is from April 2006. It was used at the Fort McClellan, Alabama, U.S. Army Military Police School. And I would presume there's probably been a few tweaks to this document since then. And I was able to find an earlier version of the document from many, many years before. I think it was from the 80s. So this has been revised before. And there's a lot of continuities. It involves a lot of stuff about troop formations, certain riot control weapons, things like that, as well as it talks about how a task force set up domestically would have its own PSYOPs unit. And psychological operations, I believe, are not legal for the U.S. military.
Well, let me stop you right there for a second, because I thought that was one of the more interesting. The whole thing is interesting, and I'm still combing through it. You know, I just got access to it today. But it talks about internment camps where internees will be re-educated. Okay, they talk about into developing an appreciation of U.S. policies. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? I mean, so if you and I don't agree with U.S. policies, we're out there protesting, how are they going to re-educate us?
Yeah. I think that's the earlier document that you're talking about. That was more specifically in detail to the management of the detention facilities, which surfaced a few months ago. This one is a little bit more general than that. It doesn't go quite to that. It mainly has to do with saying this is our escalation of force inside the detention facilities. I didn't notice anything about it getting to the re-education of people, but it does get to the degree of force that will be enabled. And it also talks about how things like gasoline, firearms can be restricted. And I think what we saw during Hurricane Katrina, which happened right around the same kind of time as this was released, that the military was behaving in much the same way. They were attempting to seize firearms from people without Fourth Amendment warrants and procedures, and because probably they were trained as military police to not worry about the Fourth Amendment in terms of things like firearms. It also gets a lot to military intelligence, analyzing protest groups and things of that nature. So it's really at a broad kind of like ground level, sort of grunts, MPs, like this is how, in the situation of large riots, this is what we would do. And so in the 1990s, during the LA riots, the old plan, which was called the Garden Plot, which was Con Plan 3502's predecessor, would have entailed training very similar to this in terms of how they were, trying to manage crowds and that kind of thing. And so I think what people need to look at if they're trying to research into this is what are the parameters of this intelligence situation when they're going to collect intelligence. This doesn't talk about advanced agencies like the Defense Intelligence Agency or the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which does a lot of, kind of compiling of data together. And I just think that while this shows a very certain heavily militarized tactics, it shows, when they line up people that are suited up as riot police, these are the psychological tactics to intimidate protesters and that kind of thing, as well as, again, run detention facilities that are patrolled with lethal force.
I'm looking at the document right now. Definitely a show of force, intimidation. Primary function of the military will be breaking up unauthorized gatherings. They're going to be patrolling the streets. They're going to be looking for any disturbance areas, prevent lawless acts. I wonder what they consider an unauthorized gathering. This is crazy. Military forces will be present to show, like I said before, a show of force, intimidation. They will establish roadblocks, which they're already doing in California, by the way, to stop drunk drivers. And they will break up crowds, employ crowd control, conduct street patrols, and, this is scary stuff. Tell us about some of the deadly force and the non-lethal force. What kind of weapons will they be using?
Well, essentially they're authorized to, what they say is defend themselves or defend against serious elements of what they call critical infrastructure, which could be any like large corporations or banks or that kind of thing. It's a real a broad spectrum of things which they're essentially authorized to use force under. But what's frustrating about these documents is that they really are clearly not written in reference to constitutional government or limited government at all. Like there's no representation of the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, for searches, the right of people to possess firearms in civil emergencies.
It's martial law. Because it's
Right.
martial law, everything's out the window.
Yeah, and there are direct references to the phrase martial law in this document. They say that, well, only under curfew could the military, under federal control, really, only under martial law could they impose a curfew, but we will definitely support local officials when they're running curfews. So everything that's sort of like underneath a full-scale martial law, like this is the kind of pattern and the kind of information which you should review and have a good sense of whenever you feel like you might encounter, any military acting domestically, even if it's not a full-blown, complete martial law scenario. They're still going to kind of be acting along this pattern, again, as we saw in Katrina. So as we want to try to get an understanding of these things, as well as hopefully intervene politically and get these kinds of things revealed and out in the open and not secret. I mean, I think personally, if we're detained in military facilities like this thing lays out, we do deserve warning shots. Like, could we demand that from our congressional representatives? We have to basically look at how to reform these policies, as well as obviously, showing everybody, the public, elected officials, and everyone, and good people in the military and bureaucracies too, that this isn't okay.
That's exactly it right there. We need to get this information out to all our friends and family who are in the military. Because, our military is waking up to this as well. They're starting to come to the realization that they are working for the offshore banking cartels who run them and who are turning them against their own people. So, and I for one, have friends who are in active military as both veterans, and they're simply not going to stand for it. So, in closing, anything else you'd like to add before we go?
I just think that everybody, can do this kind of research. A lot of primary source stuff comes out. Sites like publicintelligence.net and cryptome.org is another really good one. You find a lot of really excellent gems, and then people need to pick these things apart, pass them around, start finding new ones, and start trying to suss out new sources, because they're trying to clamp down on leaks, right now as fast as they can and build a much tighter secret government. And it's really important for all of us to work against that, because we can clearly see from this kind of documents that the planning is not really congruent what we think of, as an open society, as a limited constitutional government. We can clearly see that's not the way that these kind of things tend to be set up.
That's right. Hey, before we go, I almost forgot to ask you, you're the one that brought this to our attention, the DRE program in Minneapolis, where the police officers at Occupy Wall Street protest events, they were giving a list